So tell the court again why you fired the only nurse who tried to save her. The question landed in the conference room with the cold precision of a scalpel, and for a moment, nobody moved. Not the hospital's attorneys in their dark suits. Not the board members lined shoulder to shoulder along the polished walnut wall. Not even Richard Vale, chief executive of St. Catherine Medical Center, whose fingers had been resting on a glass of water until that sentence made them tighten around it. The room on the 21st floor had been designed to calm donors and impress regulators. All soft recessed lighting, framed awards, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. But none of that warmth reached the table now. Everything felt white, hard, overlit. Naomi Brooks sat near the far end beside her lawyer, hands folded neatly over a legal pad she had not written on once. Her navy suit was simple, pressed, careful. The kind of suit a woman buys when she knows she cannot afford to look uncertain. The fluorescent hum above them blended with the faint hiss of the air vent, and somewhere beyond the glass, a helicopter crossed the gray afternoon sky toward another hospital. Naomi did not look up. She kept her eyes on the reflection in the tabletop instead. A pitcher of water, 3 yellow legal pads, a silver recorder with its red light blinking steadily, and the blurred outline of the man who had signed her termination papers less than 72 hours after she saved a child's life. Across from her, Richard Vale cleared his throat, but the sound came out thin. Beside him sat Dr. Evelyn Whitmore, chief medical officer, her pearl earrings catching the light each time she turned her head just enough to appear composed. She had mastered that expression years ago, Naomi thought. The expression that said concern while hiding calculation. The expression that had followed Naomi down the pediatric wing when security took her badge and asked her to leave through the employee exit. Let the record reflect, Naomi's attorney said quietly, that the witness is taking his time before answering. A court reporter's fingers moved like dry rain across the stenotype machine. Tap. Pause. Tap tap. Richard finally leaned back. We terminated Ms. Brooks for violating hospital protocol, he said. His voice was practiced, almost gentle, the kind meant to sound reasonable on television. She acted outside the chain of command during a critical event involving a minor patient. Naomi heard the sentence the way she had heard so many things at St. Catherine. Carefully worded, polished, built to protect everyone except the person telling the truth. Her lawyer, Claire Bennett, did not flinch. She was still in the cream blouse she had worn since 6 a.m., though the collar had softened and one dark curl had come loose near her temple. She slid a single document across the table with 2 fingers. Interesting, she said, because according to your own medication override log, the chain of command failed before my client ever touched that crash cart. The silence that followed was different this time. Heavier. More dangerous. Naomi lifted her gaze at last. Richard Vale's eyes flicked to the paper, then to Dr. Whitmore, and in that tiny movement, in that half-second of shared panic, she felt the first crack. Not victory. Not yet. Just the sound a wall makes when the truth finally reaches it. Outside, thunder rolled low over the city. Inside, the red light on the recorder kept blinking, patient as a heartbeat. And for the first time since they had marched her out of pediatrics and called her a liability, Naomi Brooks understood that this room was not where her life had ended. It was where their version of it was beginning to fall apart. 72 hours earlier, the rain had been coming down so hard against the ambulance bay windows that the whole pediatric floor seemed to breathe with it, a soft rattling at the glass, a silver blur under the parking lot lights. Naomi Brooks stepped out of room 614 with a chart in one hand and the sharp, clean smell of sanitizer still clinging to her sleeves. It was a little after 2 a.m., the kind of hour when a hospital looked awake but felt haunted, all dimmed hallway sconces, polished linoleum, and distant monitor tones rising and falling like mechanical lullabies. Her feet ached in her white nursing shoes. The coffee in the break room had gone bitter an hour ago. She had 7 more charts to check before shift change, and 1 text message on her phone from her mother asking whether she could pick up groceries on the way home. Naomi had not answered yet. She always waited until there was a quiet minute. St. Catherine never gave her many of those. At the far end of the hall, room 618 stood half open. Warm cartoon lights spilled through the doorway, bright pink and pale blue against the colder hospital glow. Naomi slowed as she passed because she recognized the patient name on the door. Sophie Bennett, 8 years old, severe asthma history, peanut allergy, admitted for respiratory observation after a school field trip reaction that had turned scary fast. Naomi had checked on her twice already that night. Sophie had been pale, polite, and trying very hard not to cry in front of her mother. The mother had been composed in the way only deeply frightened people sometimes were, shoulders straight, voice low, hands never still. Naomi heard a soft cough from inside the room, then another, thinner this time. She glanced in. Sophie was sitting up higher now, small shoulders stiff beneath the blanket, one hand pressed against the center of her chest. The animated movie still played on mute across the room, but nobody was watching it. Claire Bennett stood near the bed with a paper cup of water, her silk blouse wrinkled now, her hair pulled back too quickly to look intentional. She says her throat feels strange, Claire said the second she saw Naomi. Not dramatic, not demanding, just fast. Too fast. Naomi crossed the room immediately. Strange how, sweetheart? She asked, keeping her voice gentle as she set the chart down. Sophie swallowed and looked up at her with eyes that were suddenly too wide. Tight, she whispered. And hot. Naomi felt the shift before she saw it. The faint flush creeping up the child's neck. The tiny restless movement of her fingers over the blanket. The way her breathing had changed from tired to careful, like each breath had to be negotiated. Naomi reached for the medication scanner clipped at the end of the bed and read the last administration entry. Her stomach tightened. 23 minutes earlier, a new dose had been entered after a verbal order from overnight coverage. Different manufacturer. Same category on paper. Not always the same in a real body. Naomi looked back at Sophie, then at the monitor, where the numbers had begun to drift in the wrong direction by degrees small enough to fool a tired person. She was not tired anymore. Outside, thunder rolled across Atlanta like a cart over. Metal tracks. Inside room 618, the air changed. Naomi stepped closer to the bed, felt the first cold edge of instinct rise in her chest, and knew this night was about to split in two. Naomi moved before panic could take the room. She set 2 fingers lightly against Sophie Bennett's wrist, counted once, then looked up at the monitor again. The oxygen saturation was slipping, not crashing, not yet, just gliding downward with the quiet danger of something that wanted to look harmless until it was too late. Claire saw the change in Naomi's face and went still. What is happening? She asked, her voice thinner now, the paper cup trembling just enough to send a drop of water onto the blanket. Naomi kept her eyes on Sophie. Sweetheart, I need you to stay with me, all right? Keep taking slow breaths for me. In through your nose if you can. Sophie tried, but the inhale caught halfway, shallow and wrong. Naomi pressed the call button and reached for the bedside phone in the same motion. Her voice, when it came, was clear, clipped, trained. I need respiratory in room 618 now, and I need the overnight attending notified immediately. She gave the room number twice. No wasted words. No rise in her tone. Just urgency sharpened into control. The nurse tech at the desk answered first, then transferred her to the resident line. Naomi gave the medication entry, the patient history, the symptom onset. She expected movement on the other end. What she got was hesitation. Dr. Whitmore reviewed the chart earlier, the resident said. The order stands. Naomi looked at Sophie's neck, where the flush had deepened under the soft cartoon light. Then Dr. Whitmore needs to come see her in person, Naomi said. Now. There was a pause long enough to feel insulting. Then the resident exhaled softly, like Naomi had become an inconvenience instead of a warning. Dr. Whitmore is in the administrative suite with overnight operations. She said to continue observation unless there is a measurable airway event. Naomi stared at the phone for half a second. Around her, the room had narrowed to sounds. Rain against glass. Monitor beeps spaced too far apart. The thin friction of Sophie's breathing. You are getting one, Naomi said, and hung up. Claire took a step closer to the bed. Should I call someone? Should I call another doctor? Naomi adjusted the child's pillow and raised the head of the bed a few inches. I am calling everybody I need to call. Her voice stayed calm, but inside, something colder had begun to form. Not fear. Recognition. She had worked under Dr. Evelyn Whitmore for almost 3 years, long enough to know the woman trusted policy more than people and hierarchy more than instinct. Long enough to know that when somebody lower on the ladder noticed danger first, Whitmore's first response was almost always the same. Slow it down, contain it, make sure nobody overreacts in a way that left a paper trail. The door opened, and a respiratory therapist stepped in rolling a compact cart, followed by a young resident with sleep-creased scrubs and a badge clipped crooked at the pocket. He glanced at the monitor, then at Naomi, then at the chart on the screen. Dr. Whitmore says do not initiate emergency override without attending approval, he said. There it was. Clean. Polite. Cowardly. Naomi turned toward him fully. Look at the patient, she said. He did, finally. Sophie's lips had lost some of their color. Her small hand clutched the blanket in a fist too tight for comfort. She had a medication change 23 minutes ago, Naomi continued. Known severe allergy history. Escalating throat tightness. Respiratory effort increasing. I am telling you this is the beginning of a reaction. The resident swallowed. He looked young enough to still believe hesitation could protect him. Then his phone buzzed. He checked the screen and stiffened. Dr. Whitmore says to hold position, he said quietly. She is on her way. Naomi looked at Sophie, then at the doorway, then back at the resident. Hold position, as if danger stood still because someone in heels had not arrived yet. As if a child's airway respected titles. The room felt colder all at once, the kind of cold that lived in hospitals after midnight and made ordinary cruelty sound procedural. Naomi reached for a pair of gloves, snapped them on, and understood exactly what they were asking her to do. Stand there. Watch. Wait for permission. Let the clock decide what courage would not. 5 seconds can feel like nothing in a courtroom and forever in a hospital room. Naomi Brooks watched the numbers on the monitor dip again and knew the luxury of waiting had already expired. The respiratory therapist shifted beside the cart, uncertain, hands hovering over sealed supplies he had not been told he could touch. The resident stood near the foot of the bed with his phone still in his hand, eyes fixed on the doorway, as if authority might come walking through it and spare him from making a choice. Sophie Bennett made a small sound then, barely louder than the rain, but it changed the whole room. Not a cry, not a complaint, just the thin, strained sound of a child discovering that breathing had stopped being automatic. Claire moved closer, so fast her chair legs scraped across the floor. She cannot breathe, she said, and this time there was no restraint left in her voice. Naomi did not answer right away. She was looking at Sophie's face, at the effort gathering around her mouth, at the skin beneath her eyes, at the way fear was beginning to replace confusion. Children always knew before adults wanted to admit it. They knew when the air felt wrong. They knew when the room had turned from ordinary to dangerous. Naomi reached for Sophie's hand for one brief second, warm and damp and trembling. I am right here, she said softly. Then she let go and turned toward the resident. I need you to say it clearly. Are you ordering me not to intervene? The question hit him harder than any alarm could have. He blinked at her, throat working, shoulders pulling tight beneath wrinkled blue scrubs. He was not cruel, Naomi thought, just trained into obedience so thoroughly he had started mistaking it for judgment. Dr. Whitmore said to hold until she evaluates, he replied. Not yes, not no, just enough language to hide inside later. Naomi nodded once. There it was. The kind of answer institutions loved. Specific enough to control a lower person, vague enough to abandon them afterward. Claire stared between them, disbelief sharpening her whole face. You are standing here discussing policy while my daughter is getting worse. Nobody answered her. Nobody except the monitor, which let out another steady series of tones that had begun to sound less like reassurance and more like a warning nobody wanted written down. Naomi stepped to the bedside computer and pulled up the emergency exception policy she knew by memory, but wanted on screen anyway. Her fingers moved fast and sure. Severe allergic history. Acute symptom progression. Immediate clinical judgment permitted when delay presented risk to patient stability. The words glowed pale against the blue-white monitor light. Not dramatic. Not heroic. Just plain. Just there. She turned the screen toward the resident. Read line 4, she said. He did, and the color shifted in his face. At that exact moment the door opened, and Dr. Evelyn Whitmore entered with the dry, composed pace of someone arriving at a meeting she already considered beneath her. Her white coat looked untouched by the storm outside. Her blonde hair was pinned smooth. Even her expression felt starched. She took in the room in one sweep. The frightened mother, the respiratory cart, Naomi at the bedside, the resident caught between them. "What is going on here?" she asked, though she clearly already knew. Naomi straightened, but did not step back. "Acute medication-related reaction with escalating airway symptoms," she said. "We need to act now." Whitmore's eyes cooled another degree. "You need to lower your tone and step away from this patient," she said. "You are a nurse, not the attending." The sentence hung in the room like frost. Naomi felt it the way she had felt so many things under Whitmore's command. The correction, the ranking, the quiet reminder that skill did not matter as much as who was allowed to display it. For one beat, nobody moved. Rain ran silvered down the windows. Sophie tried to pull in another breath and could not make it cleanly. Claire whispered her daughter's name. Naomi looked from the child to the doctor to the policy still open on the screen, and something inside her became perfectly still. Not angry, not afraid, certain. She reached for the emergency button and said, with a calm that made the whole room feel suddenly smaller, "Then you can explain the paperwork later, because I am not going to explain to her mother why I stood here and watched." The emergency tone cut through the pediatric floor with a sharp, rising chime, and everything that had been cautious a second earlier snapped into motion. The respiratory therapist moved first, pulling oxygen tubing free with hands that no longer hesitated. The resident stepped aside so fast his shoulder clipped the supply cart. Claire Bennett pressed herself to the far side of the bed, one hand over her mouth, the other still reaching for her daughter as if touch alone could hold her there. Dr. Evelyn Whitmore's face hardened, not with urgency, but with insult, as though Naomi Brooks had committed the greater offense by acting in front of witnesses. Naomi did not waste another glance on her. She lowered the mask into place, checked Sophie's response, then reached for the emergency medication kit with the precision of someone who had already made peace with the consequences. "I need airway support standing by," she said. "I need a full reaction protocol opened, and I need pharmacy notified of a likely medication-related event." Her words came clean and even, each one landing where it needed to. The respiratory therapist nodded. The resident finally started writing. Sophie's eyes, glassy with fear, found Naomi over the edge of the mask. Naomi leaned close enough for the child to hear her over the monitor and the rain. "You keep following my voice," she said softly. "That is your job. I will handle the rest." It was a strange thing, the way calm could survive inside chaos if one person refused to surrender it. Sophie gave the tiniest nod. Claire let out a shaking breath that sounded like gratitude and terror all tangled together. Whitmore stepped toward the bed then, her white coat swaying at her knees, her tone clipped enough to cut paper. "Ms. Brooks, you are acting without authorization." Naomi did not turn around. "Document it," she said. The room went still for half a heartbeat after that. Not because the crisis had eased, but because everyone had heard it. The line no one was supposed to cross. The nurse speaking back to the chief physician as though the patient mattered more than the ladder between them. Then the attending from the emergency response team came through the door at last, followed by another nurse and a pharmacist with a tablet in hand. Fresh eyes took in the room in one sweep and saw what Naomi had seen minutes earlier. The attending did not argue. He stepped straight to the bedside, checked Sophie's breathing, scanned the chart, and his jaw tightened. "Who entered this substitution order?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Naomi gave a fast summary, stripped down to facts, timestamps, symptoms, response. The attending listened, then nodded once. "Continue treatment," he said. She was right to escalate. The words were not loud, but they changed the temperature in the room. Claire closed her eyes for a moment like her knees might give out if she let herself fully understand what that meant. Whitmore said nothing. She stood rigid beside the computer, one manicured hand resting on the keyboard, watching the authority she had tried to delay arrive too late to control the story. Minutes passed differently after that. Not slowly, not quickly, just with purpose. Sophie's breathing began to ease by degrees so small they would have been invisible to anyone who had not been watching from the start. The tension in her shoulders loosened. The monitor numbers climbed back, one careful point at a time. Naomi adjusted the blanket near the child's elbow and felt the room exhale around her. Claire bent over the bed and kissed Sophie's forehead, tears slipping down without sound. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was not looking at the doctors. She was looking at Naomi. Naomi gave the smallest nod and stepped back at last, feeling the sting where her badge lanyard had rubbed against the back of her neck all shift long. Relief did not come. Not fully. Because when she finally turned, she found Daniel Reed standing in the doorway in his charcoal suit, dry from the administrative wing, tablet in hand, expression already arranged into legal concern. He did not look at Sophie first. He looked at Naomi. And in that cold, measured glance, she understood before he said a word that the child was going to recover, and the hospital had already decided who it wanted to blame for the fact that she almost had not. By 3:10 a.m., the storm had begun to drift east, but the hospital still sounded like weather. Wheels humming over tile. Elevator bells in the distance. Intercom pages dissolving into static. Inside room 618, the danger had passed just enough for everybody to start protecting themselves instead of the child. Sophie Bennett lay quieter now, color returning slowly to her face, the oxygen mask fogging faintly with each steadier breath. Claire sat at her bedside with both hands wrapped around her daughter's wrist, as if she needed proof every few seconds that the pulse was still there. The attending from emergency response finished his notes, gave a brief update to pharmacy, and stepped out to make a call. The respiratory therapist packed tubing back into plastic trays. Even relief sounded clinical in a place like St. Catherine. It came in Velcro tears, printer clicks, the soft snap of chart tabs closing. Naomi Brooks reached for the used wrappers near the counter out of habit, then stopped herself. Her hands had begun to shake, not from panic now, but from the crash that always followed control. She looked down at them once, flexed her fingers, and tucked them still against the edge of the sink. Ms. Brooks. Daniel Reed's voice came from the doorway, smooth as polished stone. A word. He did not ask her to step outside like a colleague. He said it like a summons. Naomi turned. Reed stood with his tablet against his chest, charcoal tie straight, shoes so glossy they reflected the ceiling lights in hard white streaks. Beside him, Dr. Evelyn Whitmore had recovered the expression she wore in board meetings and donor photos, the one that made coldness look almost respectable. Neither of them looked at Sophie. Neither of them looked at Claire. They looked only at Naomi, and in that choice the truth of the next hour was already written. Naomi glanced once toward the bed. Claire met her eyes, saw something in the room shift, and stood up slowly. She stays here, Claire said, her voice tired but firm. Reed gave her a sympathetic nod that felt practiced. Of course. We simply need to clarify procedural concerns with our employee. Employee, not nurse. Not the person who had acted when the room froze. Just a line item with a badge number. Naomi stepped into the hallway. The door eased shut behind her with a padded click. The pediatric corridor, so loud 10 minutes earlier, now felt strangely empty. Nightlights cast a dim amber wash along the baseboards. Cartoon sea animals smiled from the wallpaper beside hand sanitizer stations and coded door locks. A housekeeper pushed a linen cart past the far nurse's station, glanced up, then away. Reed did not waste time. You initiated an emergency override without attending authorization, he said. You challenged direct physician instruction in front of a patient family and activated a rapid response that may not have been warranted under the documented circumstances. Naomi stared at him. Rainwater still clung in silver beads to the outer edge of the window behind his shoulder. May not have been warranted, she repeated quietly. Whitmore folded her arms. The child is stable, she said. That is fortunate. But stability after the fact does not excuse insubordination during the event. Naomi felt something bitter rise at the back of her throat. Not anger exactly, something drier. Cleaner. The kind of clarity that hurt because it arrived too late to be comforting. She is stable because I did not wait for your approval to watch her get worse, Naomi said. Reed's jaw shifted. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Naomi. Be very careful how you phrase things, he said. This hospital takes patient safety seriously. The sentence was so polished it almost gleamed. Naomi looked past him through the narrow glass panel in the door. Claire was bending over Sophie again, brushing hair back from her daughter's forehead with a tenderness that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with terror survived by inches. Naomi turned back to Reed. No, she said, her voice low and steady. This hospital takes liability seriously. For a second, even the hallway seemed to hold its breath. Then Reed tapped his tablet. eyes flattening as he read from the screen. Naomi Brooks, effective immediately. You are being placed on administrative suspension pending formal review for procedural misconduct, failure to follow chain of command, and unauthorized clinical escalation. The words fell one by one, crisp and bloodless. Naomi listened without blinking. Her badge still hung warm against her chest from 12 hours of work, from running room to room, from carrying medications and chart updates, and all the invisible labor the hospital liked until it developed a spine. Reed held out his hand. Your identification. Naomi looked at the badge, then at him. Her own reflection stared back at her from the dark window glass behind his shoulder, small but unbent beneath the fluorescent light. She unclipped the lanyard slowly, placed it in his palm, and heard the plastic strike his wedding ring with a tiny, hollow sound. It was the kind of sound a life makes when someone else decides to reduce it to paperwork. The employee exit closed behind Naomi with a soft hydraulic sigh, and the night air hit her skin like cold water. The rain had stopped, but the parking lot still gleamed under the sodium lights, every painted line shining amber on wet pavement. For a moment, she just stood there, beneath the awning in her scrubs and light jacket, staring at her own reflection in the glass door where her badge had been a minute ago. Without it, she looked unfinished, like somebody had erased a part of her outline and expected the rest to stay standing. A shuttle bus rolled past the far side of the lot, tires whispering through puddles. Somewhere above, a helicopter crossed the low clouds again, its sound fading into the city before she could decide whether it made her feel small or just tired. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself and started walking toward the employee garage with her tote bag knocking lightly against her hip. She had worked 12 straight hours, saved a child, and lost her job before sunrise. The sentence did not feel real enough to belong to her yet. At the gate, the overnight parking attendant gave her a look he tried to hide. News traveled fast in hospitals, faster than infection, faster than mercy. Naomi kept her face still, signed out with the temporary slip they gave suspended staff, and climbed into her 10-year-old Honda with the cracked steering wheel cover and the church flyer still tucked in the passenger door pocket. For a long time she did not turn the key. She just sat there with both hands resting on the wheel, listening to the engine of the car next to her cool in small metallic ticks. Her scrubs smelled like sanitizer and stale coffee and the faint plastic scent of oxygen tubing. There was a wrinkle in her left sleeve where Sophie had clutched her. Naomi pressed her thumb over it once, then let her hand fall. By the time she reached her apartment complex on the south side, dawn had begun to thin the sky to a pale, exhausted gray. The brick buildings looked washed out from the night rain. A grocery cart sat tipped near the dumpster. Wind moved the loose edge of a campaign flyer taped to the mailbox cluster. Naomi climbed the outside stairs to the second floor, every step heavier now that there was no hospital adrenaline left to borrow from. Inside, the apartment was quiet except for the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the slow spin of the ceiling fan in the living room. Her mother was asleep behind the half-closed bedroom door, oxygen concentrator murmuring softly at her bedside. Naomi stood still until she heard the steady rhythm of that machine and felt her own shoulders loosen by one impossible inch. Then she went to the laundry nook near the hall, sat down on the low plastic stool beside the washer, and finally let the night catch up with her. Not in sobs, not in collapse, just in silence. She stared at the machine lid where somebody years ago had scratched a crooked heart into the white paint. Her phone buzzed inside her tote. One message from payroll about administrative review. Another from an unknown number with no words, just a screenshot of the medication log timestamp. 2:01 a.m. order entered. 2:24 a.m. reaction noted. 2:27 a.m. override initiated. Naomi looked at it for a long second, heart beating slow and hard now. Somebody inside St. Catherine had sent that. Somebody had seen what they were trying to bury before the chart could be polished into something cleaner. In the dim apartment light, with her shoes still on and her hair still damp at the edges from the night air, Naomi understood that what happened in room 618 was not over. The hospital had taken her badge, her shift, her way back through the employee entrance. But somewhere inside those walls, a record still existed that did not know how to lie. And for the first time since Daniel Reed held out his hand for her identification, Naomi felt something stronger than shock settle quietly into place. Not hope. Not yet. Something sharper. The beginning of refusal. By late morning, the hospital had switched into its daytime face, the polished one. Sunlight spread across the glass front of St. Catherine Medical Center, turning the lobby into a clean cathedral of marble, orchids, and donor plaques. Volunteers in pale blue jackets smiled near the information desk. Fresh coffee drifted from the cafe by the elevators. Families came and went carrying balloons, discharge papers, and the thin, fragile hope hospitals sold better than they admitted. From the outside, nothing looked cracked. But Claire Bennett had spent the night in room 618, and she had learned something about polished places. The brighter they shone, the more carefully they hid what happened in the dark. Sophie was sleeping now, her breathing steadier, one stuffed rabbit tucked under her elbow, the monitor beside her finally sounding ordinary again. Claire stood near the window in the same wrinkled blouse she had worn all night and watched the city traffic move below in slow ribbons of silver and white. She had not left for coffee. She had not changed clothes. She had not stopped replaying the moment the nurse with the calm voice had stepped forward while everybody else stalled behind titles and language. Around 10:15 a.m., a patient care tech named Lena came in with fresh linens and the careful, unreadable expression hospital staff wore when they knew more than policy allowed them to say. She changed the pillowcase, adjusted the blanket, checked the trash bin, then paused with her hand resting on the bed rail. "Your daughter is doing better," she said quietly. Claire nodded. Because one person refused to wait. Lena's eyes flicked to the closed door, then back to Sophie. "Yes, ma'am." The room went still again. Not empty. Waiting. Claire crossed her arms. "They told me the nurse acted recklessly." Lena did not answer at first. She folded the used sheet into a square too precise to be casual. People say a lot of things in this building once administration gets ahead of the chart. Claire felt the sentence settle into her bones. What does that mean? Lena glanced toward the hallway once more. It means there are the notes written in the room, and then there are the stories written after. Claire stepped closer. "Do you know her name?" "Naomi Brooks," Lena said. "Night shift pediatrics." The name landed with weight. A real name always did. Claire repeated it once in her mind, as if naming the woman properly might keep the hospital from reducing her to a file. Lena lifted the linen bag and moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the handle. "If I were you," she said without turning around, "I would ask for the medication room footage before somebody decides it is only for internal review." Claire stared at her. "Footage?" Lena opened the door halfway. "Camera over the Pix's cabinet. Camera in the side hall. They see more than people think." Then she was gone, the wheels of her linen cart humming softly over tile. Claire stood very still. Outside the room, a nurse laughed at something near the station. An overhead page called for transport on the 4th floor. Somewhere down the hall, a child cried once, then quieted. Ordinary sounds. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. Claire looked at Sophie, at the tiny rise and fall of her daughter's chest, then reached for her phone. She did not call hospital administration. She did not call the patient relations office with its scripted sympathy and warm, hold music. She called her assistant downtown and asked for the number of a litigation paralegal who knew how to preserve evidence before institutions learned to scrub it clean. As the call connected, Claire looked through the narrow glass panel in the door toward the nurse's station, where two administrators in press suits were speaking in low voices beside a rolling computer stand. One of them was Daniel Reed. He was smiling in that patient, managerial way men like him did when they thought the room still belonged to them. Claire watched him for a long second, then turned back to her sleeping daughter. The first lie had already been told. Now she wanted to see how many systems it took to hold it up. At 1:40 p.m., the light in room 618 had changed from pale morning silver to the warmer gold of late afternoon, and with it the whole room seemed less like a crisis site and more like a place trying very hard to look ordinary again. A meal tray sat untouched on the counter beside a sweating cup of apple juice. The television played a muted cartoon about talking animals who never stayed scared for long. Outside the door, nurses traded shift notes in low voices, while rolling workstations clicked softly over tile. Inside, Claire Bennett sat in the vinyl chair beside her daughter's bed with her suit jacket folded across her lap and a legal pad balanced on one knee. On it she had written 3 things in careful block letters: medication room footage, override log, Naomi Brooks. She had underlined the last name twice. Sophie stirred first with a small wrinkle in her forehead, then a blink, then the slow, disoriented look of a child returning from a place she had not meant to visit. Claire leaned forward so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. "Hey, baby," she whispered. "Easy. You are all right." Sophie looked around the room, took in the tubing, the rabbit tucked under her arm, the sunlight on the wall, and then found her mother's face. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. Voice rough with sleep. Claire felt the question like a stone dropped into deep water. "No," she said at once. "Not one thing." Sophie turned her head slightly toward the doorway, as if checking whether someone else was listening. Children noticed power faster than adults like to admit. "Where is the nurse?" she asked. Claire kept her voice gentle. "Which nurse, sweetheart?" Sophie's brows drew together with the effort of memory. "The one with the braids. The nice one." She told me to keep following her voice. The room seemed to narrow around that sentence. Claire set the legal pad aside. "Naomi?" she asked softly. Sophie gave the smallest nod. "They were all talking," she whispered. "But she was the only one looking at me." Claire reached for her daughter's hand and pressed it between both of hers. The skin was warmer now, stronger. Alive in the ordinary way people forgot to be grateful for until somebody nearly took it from them. "Do you remember what happened after that?" Claire asked. Sophie swallowed. Her eyes moved to the ceiling for a second, then back to her mother. "I could not get enough air," she said. "I heard that doctor lady say wait." But Naomi did not wait. Claire went very still. "The doctor lady?" Sophie nodded again. "The blonde one." She was mad. A silence followed, but it was no longer empty. It was filling with shape, with order, with the first clean edges of truth. Claire brushed a strand of hair away from Sophie's forehead. "Did anyone tell you Naomi did something bad?" Sophie's mouth tightened in a tiny expression that looked far too old for 8 years old. "A man in a gray suit asked if the nurse scared me," she said. "I told him no. I told him she saved me." Claire did not need to ask which man. She could already see Daniel Reed in the doorway with his polished shoes and his careful voice, bending the story toward whatever version protected the institution first. Sophie squeezed her mother's fingers once. "Do not let them fire her," she said. There was no drama in the way she said it. No tears. Just the plain moral clarity children still carried before the world taught them how often adults traded it for convenience. Claire felt something inside her settle with final, irreversible weight. She leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead. "They should not have," she said, "and I am not going to let them bury what happened." Outside the room, footsteps approached, measured and official. A knock sounded against the half-open door. Claire looked up and saw Daniel Reed standing there with a patient relations coordinator at his side and a folder in his hand. His smile was gentle, practiced, almost fatherly. He had come, Claire realized, not to check on her daughter, but to see what version of the truth had survived the afternoon. Daniel Reed stepped into the room with the careful softness of a man who wanted to look harmless while carrying damage in a folder. The patient relations coordinator beside him wore a pastel blazer and the kind of sympathetic expression hospitals seem to issue with employee badges, gentle enough to calm families, vague enough to promise nothing. Reed stopped just inside the doorway, one hand still resting on the file against his chest, and let his eyes move from Claire Bennett to Sophie in the bed, as if he were taking inventory instead of checking on a child. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice low and polished, "I wanted to personally follow up now that your daughter is improving. We are all so relieved." Claire did not stand. She sat straighter in the vinyl chair and watched him the way a trial lawyer watched a witness who believed charm could outpace facts. "Are you?" she said. Reed gave a small, patient smile, the kind meant to smooth over sharp edges before they formed. "St. Catherine takes events like last night very seriously. We have already opened an internal review concerning the actions of the staff involved." Sophie turned her head on the pillow and looked at him with the clear, unblinking suspicion children reserved for adults who talked too much and meant too little. Claire laid one hand lightly over her daughter's blanket. "Then let us save everyone some time," she said. "The nurse who acted first was Naomi Brooks. She recognized the reaction before your physicians did. She escalated because your chain of command failed. And according to my daughter, someone in a gray suit has already been in this room trying to shape her memory." The patient relations coordinator shifted almost invisibly. Reed did not, but the smile left his face in degrees. "I think there may have been a misunderstanding," he said. Our concern was simply whether the patient felt distress during an unauthorized intervention. Claire looked at him for a long second, then reached for the legal pad beside her and tore off a sheet with 3 names and 2 timestamps written on it. She held it up between 2 fingers. At 2:01 a.m., a medication substitution order was entered. At 2:24 a.m., symptoms began. At 2:27 a.m., emergency override was initiated. I want the Pyxis cabinet footage preserved, the side hallway camera preserved, the complete override log preserved, and every access record on that medication order locked before your internal review has a chance to become creative. The room changed. Not dramatically. More like a floor revealing a crack beneath expensive carpet. Reed blinked once. The coordinator turned toward him with a quick glance she clearly regretted. Claire kept going. I have already sent a litigation hold notice to my office. If any footage disappears, if any charting is altered, if any staff member is pressured to adjust their statement, Discovery will find it. Sophie, still small against the white pillow, looked from her mother to Reed and then asked in a dry little voice, "Are you the man who asked if Naomi scared me?" Silence fell so cleanly, it almost sounded deliberate. Reed's throat moved. "I only wanted to make sure you felt safe," he said. Sophie held his gaze with the blunt honesty adults spent years learning how to avoid. "I felt safe when she came in," she said. "I did not feel safe when everybody else was talking." Claire did not smile. She did not need to. The truth had just arrived from the one witness in the room nobody could reduce to politics. Reed drew a breath and opened the folder in his hand, perhaps out of habit, perhaps to buy himself 3 seconds. Inside was a typed summary, clipped neatly, its language already doing what language like that always did, sanding down danger until negligence sounded procedural. Claire saw enough upside down to catch one phrase: deviation from physician direction. Reed noticed where her eyes landed and closed the folder too late. "This is exactly why a formal review is necessary," he said. There were multiple decision points. Claire stood then, slowly, with the quiet control of a woman who had spent years making men regret confusing poise for softness. "No," she said. There was one decision point. Naomi chose the patient. Your people chose the institution. Reed looked at her, and for the first time since he entered the room, he no longer seemed like the person managing it. Through the glass in the door, the nurse's station buzzed with ordinary afternoon motion, printers spitting labels, phones ringing, charts changing hands. But inside room 618, the balance had shifted. Reed saw it. Claire saw that he saw it. And somewhere inside the hospital system, hidden under time stamps and passwords and fluorescent light, the records were waiting to decide which version of the night could still survive being read in full. By 6:30 that evening, the conference room on the 14th floor of Bennett and Cole smelled like coffee gone cold, printer toner, and the first clean edge of a fight that had finally found its shape. Claire Bennett sat at the end of the table with her hospital wristband still on, a yellow legal pad open beside 3 printed exhibits now clipped in careful stacks. The city outside her law office windows was turning copper and blue, headlights threading through downtown Atlanta below, but nobody in the room had looked at the view in over an hour. Her paralegal had pulled the preliminary access logs. Her litigation associate had drafted the preservation demand. And on the wall screen, frozen in grainy overhead video from the medication room, a timestamp glowed in white numbers while a badge swipe opened the Pyxis cabinet exactly 23 minutes before Sophie's symptoms began. "Run it again," Claire said. The associate tapped the keyboard. The clip restarted. A nurse entered first, then stepped back. A resident leaned in, uncertain. Then Dr. Evelyn Whitmore appeared in frame for 3 seconds. Not enough for a casual observer to notice much, more than enough for a lawyer to understand sequence. She did not stay long. She did not need to. Her badge opened the drawer. Her hand selected the substitution. Then she left. Claire watched the screen without moving. "And the side hall?" she asked. Another click. Another angle. This time the image showed Naomi Brooks crossing into room 618 with a chart in one hand and urgency already gathering in the way she walked. No hesitation. No performance. Just the posture of someone whose attention had narrowed to one human life. The associate paused the footage. "You can see Reed enter 21 minutes later," he said. "He arrives after the response team." Claire looked down at the typed incident summary St. Catherine had sent her 3 hours earlier. In neat administrative language, it stated that unauthorized nursing escalation had triggered confusion during a non-critical event. Claire set the paper beside the footage still and let the lie reveal itself by proximity. "They are not covering one bad call," she said quietly. "They are constructing a safer story." Across town, Naomi sat at her kitchen table under the weak yellow light above the stove, staring at the business card Claire's assistant had just dropped off with the courier envelope. Outside her apartment window, tires hissed on damp pavement, and somebody down the hall was heating onions in a skillet, the smell drifting under the door. Her mother had fallen asleep after evening medication, the oxygen concentrator murmuring softly in the bedroom like distant static. Naomi turned the card over once, then back again. Claire Bennett, partner, trial litigation. Underneath, in blue ink, a single sentence: "You were right to act. Call me tonight." Naomi had spent the day fielding 2 payroll emails, 1 human resources notice, and 1 voicemail from Daniel Reed reminding her not to discuss internal events during active review. Internal events. As if a child nearly losing air could be reduced to a corporate phrase and filed away with compliance forms. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she did not know. Naomi answered carefully. For a second, there was only hallway noise on the other end, a rolling cart, a distant intercom page. Then a woman's voice dropped low enough to survive fear. "My name is Tasha Morgan," the voice said. "I work nights in cardiology." Naomi sat straighter. "How did you get this number?" "It does not matter," Tasha replied. "What matters is this is not the first time they tried to pin a physician error on a black nurse and call it professionalism." Naomi said nothing. She did not need to. Some truths arrived fully formed. Tasha exhaled shakily. 3 years ago, it was dosage documentation. Last fall, it was a missed allergy note they blamed on another woman from float pool. Every time it is the same. Quiet pressure. Paperwork. Suspension. Then everybody learns to keep their head down. Naomi looked at the card on her table. Then at the dark window above the sink where her own reflection sat small and still in the glass. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. The answer came back without pause. Because this time the mother is a lawyer, the footage still exists, and for once they fired the wrong woman. In Claire's office, another email landed with a soft chime. Anonymous sender. Attached statement. Then another. Then one more. Nurses. Text. A resident willing to describe the verbal instruction to wait. Claire watched the inbox begin to fill and understood that the case had just expanded beyond room 618. This was no longer one child, one nurse, one dangerous night. This was pattern, practice, selection, the kind of pattern institutions pray never learns how to introduce itself in court. Claire reached for her pen and wrote a new heading across the top of the yellow page in slow, deliberate letters. Retaliation, negligent supervision, racial scapegoating. Then she underlined the last phrase once and picked up the phone to call Naomi herself. The lawsuit was filed at 8:12 the next morning, and by 9 a.m. the silence inside St. Catherine had changed shape. It was no longer the calm hush of polished hallways and donor-funded decor. It was the brittle kind, the kind that travels ahead of bad news and settles over a building before anyone says the words out loud. Nurses read the headline on their phones behind medication carts. Residents paused outside elevators with coffee cooling in their hands. At the front desk, 2 volunteers pretended not to notice the local station playing a segment about a pediatric emergency, an allegedly wrongful suspension, and a law firm accusing one of Atlanta's most respected hospitals of retaliation, negligent supervision, evidence risk, and racial scapegoating. The lobby still smelled like lemon polish and roasted coffee beans from the cafe, but now there was another scent too, sharper and harder to name. Exposure. On the 12th floor, Daniel Reed stood in a boardroom with the blinds half drawn against the morning sun, while members of the hospital executive committee stared at printed filings spread across the table like contamination nobody wanted to touch first. The complaint was thorough, disciplined, merciless in its restraint. It did not shout. It did not need to. It attached the footage timestamps, the override log, the badge access record, the witness statements. And Sophie Bennett's own recollection. It named Naomi Brooks. It named Dr. Evelyn Whitmore. It named the institution. By the second page, The story St. Catherine had been building since dawn 2 days earlier had already begun to collapse under the weight of its own edits. Reed looked toward Whitmore once, and for the first time since this began, she did not look composed. Her mouth was set too tightly. One pearl earring caught the light as she turned her head toward the window, as though the city outside might offer a cleaner version of events than the one now sitting in 11-point font before the board. "We can still contain this," she said, but the sentence sounded thinner than it probably had in her head. Across town, Naomi sat in Claire Bennett's office wearing the same navy suit from the deposition, though today it felt different on her shoulders. Not lighter, just truer. Claire stood by the conference table with a red pen in one hand and a copy of the filed complaint in the other, while her team moved around them in controlled motion, printers humming, email alerts chiming, legal pads filling with names. Tasha Morgan had signed an affidavit before sunrise. So had Lena from pediatrics. Then came a respiratory therapist. Then the resident who had been told to wait. Each statement was careful, frightened, real. Not dramatic. Not polished. Better than polished. They matched. Claire set the pen down and looked at Naomi. "They spent years teaching people to stay quiet," she said. "Then they gave everybody the same night to remember." Naomi looked through the office glass at the city below, lanes of traffic moving under a bright Georgia sky, ordinary people on ordinary streets with no idea how close a child had come to becoming a footnote in an internal review. Her phone buzzed with a news alert, then another. St. Catherine Board opens independent investigation. Chief Medical Officer placed on administrative leave. Hospital shares fall after filing. Naomi read each line without expression, but something inside her shifted anyway. Not triumph. This was too serious for that. Something steadier. The feeling of a door opening because somebody finally pushed where the frame was already rotten. In the hospital, nurses who had spent years lowering their eyes began lifting them. One by one, they forwarded old emails, saved screenshots, meeting notes, corrected charts, small records of large habits. The kind of evidence that only looks minor until you lay enough of it side by side to see the design. By noon, the board had hired outside counsel. By 1 p.m., Dr. Whitmore's hospital profile had disappeared from the staff directory. By 2:15, Daniel Reed's assistant was carrying banker boxes out of his office while employees pretended to review charts and watch through reflected glass. No alarms sounded. No speeches were made. Institutions rarely fall with drama at first. They fall in memos, access denials, escorted meetings, and the slow, unmistakable withdrawal of protection. Naomi stood at the office window with Claire beside her and watched sunlight move across the neighboring buildings in long, pale sheets. "They thought they were firing a nurse," Claire said quietly. Naomi kept her eyes on the city. "No," she replied. "They thought nobody would notice who they were willing to sacrifice." 3 weeks later, the pediatric wing smelled the same. Lemon cleanser. Warm plastic. Coffee drifting from a paper cup left too long at the nurse's station. The wallpaper still held its painted whales and smiling octopuses. The overhead lights still cast that soft, false morning over everything, even in the middle of the afternoon. But the silence was different now. It no longer belonged to fear. Naomi Brooks felt that the moment the elevator doors opened and she stepped onto the 6th floor wearing a charcoal suit, low heels, and a visitor badge clipped to her lapel where her hospital identification used to hang. She carried no clipboard, no medication tray, no stethoscope looped around her neck. Only a slim leather folder and the calm posture of a woman who had already survived being underestimated. A few heads turned when she entered the corridor. One nurse paused mid-charting. A respiratory therapist near the supply room straightened and gave the smallest nod. Nobody looked away too quickly this time. Through the long window at the end of the hall, Atlanta shone under a clean blue sky, traffic crawling in silver bands beneath the late fall sun. Naomi walked past room numbers she knew by memory, past the hand sanitizer stations, past the linen closet where she had once hidden for 30 seconds to cry after losing a patient she still thought about sometimes. Today her steps made almost no sound on the polished floor. Claire Bennett was waiting near. Room 618 with a man from outside counsel and a member of the independent review panel, both holding legal pads, both suddenly very aware that the person they had once reduced to an internal problem now stood at the center of the record they were trying to repair. Claire offered Naomi a look that held gratitude without pity, respect without performance. You ready? She asked softly. Naomi glanced through the half-open door before answering. Sophie sat upright in bed. No oxygen, no fear in her eyes now. Only a coloring book open across her lap and a box of crayons tipped on its side beside her. The child looked up, saw Naomi, and smiled in that immediate, uncomplicated way adults spent years forgetting how to do. Mom, she whispered, though everyone had already noticed. That is her. Naomi stepped into the room, and all at once the legal language, the filings, the board reviews, the television segments, all of it seemed to fall back behind the one simple fact that mattered most. The little girl was breathing easily. Sunlight lay across the blanket in pale gold bars. A stuffed rabbit rested under one arm, its ears bent from use. Sophie held up a page from the coloring book. It was a drawing in thick, determined crayon lines, a hospital bed, a woman with long braids, and a speech bubble in careful block letters that read, "She stayed." Naomi felt something catch low in her chest, small and steady and almost too warm to name. She took the picture with both hands, as if it were something fragile enough to deserve ceremony. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. Behind her, the outside counsel shifted papers and cleared his throat, ready to begin the formal interview, ready to mark time and sequence and liability in neat numbered questions. Naomi turned back toward the door before he could speak. Down the hallway, through the glass of a conference room, she caught a glimpse of Daniel Reed being escorted by security toward the administrative elevators, a cardboard banker box in his arms, his shoulders stiff, his tie no longer straight. No one announced it. No one needed to. Accountability rarely arrived with applause. It arrived in access revoked, titles stripped, witnesses finally heard. Naomi looked at him only once, then let the image pass without feeding it anything more. She did not come back for revenge. She came back because the truth had asked for a voice, and hers had survived. When she turned again, Sophie was still watching her with that open, certain smile children gave the people who had earned a place in their memory. Naomi slipped the drawing into her folder beside the formal papers and stood in the doorway while the afternoon light pooled softly across the floor. The hospital had tried to make her disappear into procedure, but the room held a better record now. A child alive, a mother unafraid, and a woman once pushed out through the employee exit standing in full daylight where no one could make her small again.